In the drawer of the nightstand in her sister's spare room in Decatur, Georgia, Margaret Asante kept a folder. Inside the folder were 31 years of performance reviews, the last 5 from her final years at Deloitte before she resigned in 1991. And then, behind those, the informal kind. Birthday cards from 4 children she had raised who were not biologically hers, school report cards she had signed as guardian, letters of recommendation she had written for college applications, a photograph from the eldest daughter's wedding where Margaret was standing in the family row. The formal reviews ended at page 5. The informal ones were the rest of the folder. She had left the folder on the nightstand in her own house for 31 years. She had moved it to her sister's nightstand in February 2023, when she had been asked to vacate the house she had lived in and maintained for 3 decades, because the youngest child had turned 30, and the family had decided, the father, Harlan, and his new wife, that the house should now be sold. Margaret had been told about the sale by Harlan's attorney, not by Harlan. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. It gave her 60 days. She had not called Harlan's children. She had not called Harlan. She had packed the folder, moved it to the nightstand at her sister's, and begun making arrangements. She had not been crying. Margaret had arrived in the Whitfield household in 1991 as the nanny for Harlan Whitfield's 4 children, 8, 6, 4, and 2 years old at the time, following the death of their mother from an aneurysm. Harlan was a corporate attorney in Atlanta, traveling frequently, in no position to raise 4 young children alone. Margaret was 29 years old, recently arrived from London, recently out of a 5-year career in financial consulting that she had genuinely loved, and entirely unprepared for what 4 small, motherless children would do to her understanding of what her life was for. She had taken the position for 2 years. She had stayed for 31. The 2 years became 4 when the youngest was ready for school, and Margaret was the only consistent adult presence those children had known since their mother died. The 4 became 8 when the eldest started high school, and the logistics of 4 teenagers in different life stages required a full-time presence that no part-time arrangement could have provided. The 8 became 31 because the children grew up, and Margaret was woven into the fabric of their lives in a way that nobody, not Margaret, not Harlan, not the children, had ever formally named or formally compensated. Harlan had paid her throughout. A salary adjusted annually, which had been generous by nanny standards, but which was not the same as the equity she would have built in her consulting career, not the same as the pension she had walked away from, not the same as the compound professional value of 31 years she had redirected into a family that was not legally hers. She had known this. She had accepted it. She had told herself every year that the knowing was worth more than the accounting. Then Harlan had remarried in 2017. His youngest was 24. Margaret had been in the house for 26 years by then, and she had told herself, this is fine. This is a good thing for Harlan. I will make room. She had made room. For 2 years, she had made room. And then Harlan's new wife, Linda, had begun making it clear in the specific way that new wives make things clear, that the presence of a previous woman in the house, even a nanny, even a longtime family employee, was a structural problem. Linda had not been aggressive. She had been persistent. She had said things about the house needing to be theirs now. She had said things about it being time for Margaret to have her own life. She had said things that were individually reasonable and collectively constituted a careful, continuous pressure. Margaret had received the attorney's letter in February 2023. She had moved to her sister's house in March. None of Harlan's children had called. Nobody in that studio knew that Margaret Asante had raised 4 children for 31 years and had been handed an attorney's letter by the 61st day. Margaret had come to Family Feud with her sister Abina, her friend Constance from her church, Constance's daughter, Ya, and a woman from her old neighborhood named Pearl, who had watched Margaret raise those children from the outside for 3 decades, and who had said, when Margaret arrived at her sister's house with her suitcase, simply, "Stay as long as you need." Margaret had said, "Thank you." Pearl had said, "Those children should be ashamed of themselves." Margaret had said, "Don't. They are not bad children. They just never named what I was to them." Pearl had said, "And that is its own shame." Steve Harvey introduced the team and got to Margaret and asked what she did. She said, "Professional caregiver, retired." He asked how long. She said, 31 years, 4 children, same family. He asked if she had her own children. She said no. He asked if she had ever regretted that. She said, "Not the choosing, only the not being chosen back." Steve set his cards down. "What does that mean?" he said quietly. And Margaret Asante told Steve Harvey about 31 years. She told it precisely and without self-pity, the way a woman tells a story she has been living so long she no longer needs to perform it. She described the 4 children's ages when she arrived. She described the performance reviews in the folder. She described the consulting career she had left at 29. She described Harlan's remarriage and the careful, continuous pressure and the attorney's letter. She described moving her folder to her sister's nightstand. She said, "None of the 4 children called." She said, "I don't believe they are bad people. I believe nobody ever taught them what I was. And that is a failure I also own. I never asked to be named. I thought the 31 years would name itself." The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey was very still. He looked at Margaret for a long time. 31 years, he said. "Yes," she said. "And the folder?" "Yes." "Performance reviews and birthday cards, and a photograph from a wedding where you stood in the family row?" "Yes." 300 people stayed completely still. Not the usual game show pause, the kind that forms around something that has arrived with its full weight. Steve stepped out from behind the podium. He pressed his handkerchief to his face. He turned away for a moment and then turned back. "Let me tell you something," he said. "I made a promise, a real promise to God, when I was at the lowest point of my life, that if I ever had the power to name what someone gave, I would name it. I would not let it go unnamed." He looked at Margaret. "What you gave those 4 children has a name. It is called a mother's work. Not because you are their biological mother. Because what you did, the 31 years, the school nights, the college applications, the wedding row, the folder, that is what a mother does. And I am naming it right now, in front of everyone, because the folder has been sitting in your nightstand for 31 years, and it is time someone said, 'We see what's in there. We see what it cost.'" "Stop everything," Steve said. He was decided and certain and moving. "We are stopping the game. This has never happened in the 45-year history of this show." He walked Margaret to the front of the stage and said, "Bring the folder." Her sister Abina reached into her bag. The folder was there. Margaret had brought it because Abina had said, "Bring it, just in case." Margaret had said, "In case of what?" Abina had said, "In case someone asks to see it." Steve held the folder. He did not open it. He held it the way you hold a record of something that mattered. He said, 31 years of this, of birthday cards and report cards and recommendation letters and one photograph from a wedding. This is a career. This is a life's work. And I want everyone watching at home to understand. Unpaid labor is still labor. Unacknowledged love is still love. And unnamed people are still people. He pulled out his phone. He called a labor and employment attorney who had worked with his foundation on domestic worker rights cases. Liv, on speaker, the whole room hearing. He explained the situation in 5 sentences. 31 years, no formal contract beyond annual salary, pension and career opportunity cost, no severance, attorney's letter. The attorney said, "There are domestic worker equity arguments worth examining, and the career opportunity cost calculation is significant." She said, "I want to take this meeting." Steve arranged the consultation and covered all costs. But Steve wasn't done. He held up his hand. There was more. He then announced that the oldest of Harlan's children, a woman named Lauren, was watching the episode. The producers had reached out to her during the taping, and she had confirmed she was watching live. He said, "Lauren, if you are watching, I want to ask you to call the woman who sat in the school row and the family row for 31 years. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." He turned to the competing family, the Chambers family from Columbus, and their matriarch, a woman named Eula, who was 74 years old, and who had been crying openly for 8 minutes, who stood up and said, "I had a woman like this. She raised my children when I was sick. I never said it the right way. I am saying it now. Thank you, Margaret." Both families received the $25,000 prize. Steve Harvey looked at Margaret, at the folder, at the camera, and said 5 words. "The folder has a name." When the episode aired 7 weeks later, the moment Steve held the folder became one of the most discussed images in the show's decade-long modern era. It reached 280 million views in 10 days. The hashtag Bjek, the folder has a name, was used by domestic workers, nannies, au pairs, long-term caregivers, and everyone who had given professional quality work to a family without a professional quality record of what it was worth. Labor rights organizations cited it. Several countries' domestic worker advocacy coalitions shared it. 3 months after the taping, Lauren called Margaret. She called on the night the episode aired. She called because she had watched it and then sat in her car in her driveway for 40 minutes and then called. Margaret answered. The call lasted 2 hours. Lauren said, "I didn't know what to call you." Margaret said, "I know." Lauren said, "You were everything." Margaret said, "I know that too." Lauren said, "I'm sorry it took 31 years in a game show." Margaret said, "The timing isn't the point. The call is the point." All 4 children called within the week. Margaret has not described those calls in detail. She has said, "It took a television program to make them count what I was to them. I would have preferred a conversation. But I will take what came." The employment attorney filed a formal domestic worker equity claim 6 months after the taping. The case was complex and ongoing at the time of this writing. Regardless of its outcome, Harlan Whitfield's attorneys reached a separate settlement with Margaret 8 months after the taping, covering retirement funds commensurate with 31 years of professional service. Margaret said, when informed, "Good. It's about time someone put the right number next to the right name." A year after the taping, the Folder Initiative, established through Steve Harvey's foundation, provides legal resources, retirement counseling, and professional recognition documentation for long-term domestic caregivers who have been employed in family settings without formal career protections. In its first year, more than 800 caregivers were assisted in documenting their professional value. The initiative's motto came from Margaret's own words. The 31 years should have named itself. It didn't. So we name it now. Today, Margaret Asante's folder has a new item in it. A letter from Lauren, dated 3 months after the taping, which begins, "You were everything we needed. We just didn't know that was a thing we were allowed to say. She keeps it at the front of the folder. Before the performance reviews, before the birthday cards, first. If this story moved you, share it with every caregiver you know. Subscribe and hit that thumbs up. Have you ever given everything to a family and been handed a letter instead of a thank you? Let us know in the comments. Ring that notification bell for more stories of people who deserve to be named.